And welcome back to another edition of the I Prefer the 80s and 90s Sports Podcast where I talk about why I prefer the sports of the 80s and 90s to the sports of today. Today's topic is going to be coaching. And the people who I feel the worst for more than anybody in sports are the coaches. And the reason why I feel the worst for the coaches today than ever before is that college football, college basketball is about the coaches. Unless you have a transcendent player, it's all about the coaches. But that's how it is presented to the country. Colorado is loved because of Deion, not because of the way they play football. Alabama is about Nick Saban. And over the years, that's how it's always been in those sports. Bear Bryant in the 70s, 60s, you know more about him than you do about his Alabama players. Tom Osborne in Nebraska, Jimmy Johnson. But the difference between today and yesterday is today all sports are controlled by the athletes. All sports have this mentality, this mantra, this attitude that the only people that really truly matter are the athletes because they play the games. And so I asked myself, what are schools looking for? And let me explain what I mean by that. Syracuse University just fired its coach, Dino Babers. Dino is a good coach, but Syracuse has not been a dominant program in years. It's been a good program, but it hasn't been what it once was. In the 80s and the 90s, Syracuse produced some good players. Obviously, we know about the history of the 60s with all those great running backs and Jim Brown, of course, and Ernie Davis winning the Heisman Trophy. Syracuse has had Marvin Harrison and Donovan McNabb in the last few years who outstanding. Marvin Harrison's a Hall of Famer. But in the last, say, 5, 6, 7 years, Syracuse has changed conferences and they play in the ACC. And they are middle of the road every year. You go to Syracuse, it's a tough game. When Syracuse comes to you, sometimes it's a tough game, but for the most part, they're not the greatest road team. But they make things interesting. A couple of years ago, they gave Clemson all Clemson can handle. And when Clemson was playing for championships, and that kind of put them on the map. They gave Notre Dame all they could handle. And it's stunning to me today that he was fired. Because I asked myself a question. I say, what are your school looking for? You're not in a program where you're expected to win a national championship. So if you go backwards So if you have one bad year, is that enough to cost you your job? College basketball. The biggest complaint about college basketball and college football, but we'll stick with college basketball, are retreads. And a retread is somebody who is a coach who gets fired from a job and gets another job in another place like really fast. And people are sick and tired of, first of all, people thought it was done based on race. And then people are like, these guys, they lose a job and they get hired someplace else real fast. It's not giving other people opportunities. Is Syracuse a destination job? It's a great school for broadcasting, but is it a football job? I mean, they've had the same college basketball coach for over 30 years. And so the question is, again, what is Syracuse looking for to make them get rid of a coach? And I thought about that this morning. What do all these schools look for when you have a team that's not going to be very good? Are you sitting there saying, we're going to hire this guy because he's going to make us better than we were the previous year? Or he's going to show that we can compete with the big boys and beat them and potentially get to the next level? Brian Kelly, he got the Notre Dame job. Notre Dame had an unbelievable year. They went 14-0 or 13-0 and got to the championship game and got steamrolled by Alabama. And so is it a case of, if you get a coach that gets a big job and he shows that he can do the big job, he'll always have a job? Syracuse was a big job. But if you coach at Vanderbilt, for example, they don't expect to win anything at Vanderbilt. They expect the kids are going to play hard and they're going to compete. But I promise you, the coaching staff isn't standing there saying, we're going to beat Alabama, LSU, Georgia, Tennessee this year. And then boosters and the crowd goes crazy. No. He said, we're going to play hard. And when they come to our field, we're going to make them earn victories. And that goes for basketball as well as other sports. Oregon State. Oregon State has Jonathan Smith as their coach. He was a good football player for them when he played college football. He's been an outstanding coach for them. But the question is, what do they say? What is an expectation? Do you say, all right, we got to win 6 games to get to the bowl, which we can, and beat Oregon? Then the boosters go, that's our guy. Or West Virginia. West Virginia's in the Big 12, which doesn't make any sense, but they're in the Big 12. They don't win. They were good in the 80s and 90s. But what's an expectation? What did you say? You say we're going to beat Texas and Oklahoma State, Kansas State, and Kansas? And that's my point. My point is, what are the expectations? In the 80s and 90s, yeah, coaches got fired. You didn't do well, you got fired. But a lot of teams were much more competitive then, I think, than they are now. And then, of course, the other thing you have to contend with today is the dreaded transfer portal, where now it's okay for kids to go to play at another school within a year and play. So I could get recruited like crazy to go to Florida. I get to Florida and I'm like, I had a good year. Great. Next year, I'm going to Colorado. Then after that, I'm going to USC. Then after that, I'm going to BYU. Then do my Mormon mission. Then I'm become a pro. Keaton Slovis, quarterback at BYU right now. Started at USC. Then he went to, I think he went to Georgia Southern. Then he went to Pittsburgh, and now he's at BYU. And so my question is, how can you blame coaches for their kids not playing well? How can you blame the coaches when they have a bad record when these kids that are coming in could be transfers? Colorado this year brought in all kinds of new players and all kinds of this and all kinds of that, including Deion. And they won the first 3 games, and everything went up. The ticket prices went up. The store merchandise went up. The queue went up. Recruiting went up. Everything has gone spectacularly well. And then they go 1-8 the rest of the way. 1-7 the rest of the way. They're not going to fire Deion. Deion just made the school millions of dollars. But they ain't win nothing. Number one. And then now the stories are they're worried about Deion leaving because take on another challenge. He lives in Texas. People think he wants to go back to Texas. And Texas A&M job is open. And so what's the comeback? The comeback is what my man from Texas A&M did. He signed a 10-year, $146 million contract. And so he got fired, and the school owes him like $76 million. That's his buyout. That's the comeback. You sign a long-term deal, guaranteed money, and then if you get fired, they got to buy you out. I mean, if I'm a football coach, I'm pulling my hair out because I can't win. And you say, huh? Well, let me explain. If you're not good enough, if you're not a name, if you're not Brian Kelly, Les Miles, for some reason I'm drawing a blank. Jimbo Fisher is his name. If you're not Jimbo Fisher, and you negotiate this humongous deal, what do you do? Dino Babers is a good coach. He's not Jimbo Fisher. He might think he is. He might think he's one of these guys. Can coach with anybody. Can coach like anybody. But the reality is, he's going to coach at where? Buffalo? Ohio University, other MAC schools. I mean, Lincoln Riley right now at USC comes into USC. Everyone is on cloud nine because they sputtered the previous couple of years. He comes in, they get 10 wins. They lose a bowl game when they were up by 20 points. Their only losses are to Utah. They played Utah twice. They beat UCLA in an epic classic, 48-45. The kid wins the Heisman. All is well. Excuse me. Then this year, they stink. They can't stop anybody. They're 7-5. They're going to get to a bowl game because they got 7 wins. No one's asking for his head yet, although they are asking for his head because they're paying him a boatload of money to win championships, not to go 7-5, and definitely not to lose to UCLA and get embarrassed like they did yesterday. Will they fire him next year and have to pay him $80 million if they still stink on defense next year? Probably. So you say, what's my point? My point, in the 80s and 90s, college coaches had more control. Coaches had a little bit less in terms of expectations, a little bit less to deal with off the field as they do today. And because of the television contracts and because of the televisions everywhere to watch everybody, every coach has a chance today to get known, to get that big win on TV that'll get them the job that they want. The coach at Oregon, Dan Lanning, nobody knew who he was. I mean, yeah, he came from the SEC, but he wasn't the head coach. It was Kirby's team. All the coaches in the SEC came from somewhere else, came from Nick Saban's tree or somebody else's tree. And had to get a moment to be seen and known. In the 80s and 90s, wasn't so much of you were used to coach for this guy. That didn't matter. You still had to coach. Steve Spurrier has a huge tree of coaches. And Urban Meyer made him look good by winning 3 national championships at 2 places. The 80s and 90s, yeah, they didn't have the same coaches didn't get paid the same money. But a coach could go into your home and guarantee your parents that he's going to take care of you, watch over you for 4 years. And I'm sure they do the same, they say the same things too today. But actually they don't, because today it's a negotiation. Today it's you go to the kid's home, you make your case, and then the questions aren't, is my son going to play? Is my daughter going to play? The questions are, all right, so what kind of deal are we going to get off the field? Will I be able to transfer if I don't like what's happening? And meanwhile, you tell the kid whatever he wants to hear, and he goes to your school and you lose, that kid's leaving and you might get fired. How fair is that? What I'm saying, there was more stability. The kids didn't dictate the terms of your life like they do today. I mean, can you imagine you're a nuclear coach, and all of a sudden you're looking forward to next season, and you got this kid coming back who you really want to play, and he's like, "Coach, can I speak to you in private?" And you're like, "Yeah, you can talk to me in private, or anything." And he says, "I'm transferring. I think I have a better opportunity to play someplace else." And you sit there and your mouth hits the floor. You're like, "Dude, you can be my starter next year. What do you mean?" "I don't believe it. You recruited 8 more guys that look just like me and play just like me. I don't believe you. I'm out of here." He goes and you go have a 3-10 season. You get fired. That's the reality. I'm going here next year because I got an offer to go to school, and the booster offered me a commercial and do all these things, and I'm going to get like NIL money of like $6,000, $60,000, $600,000. And you're like, "Oh my God, I told your mother and father I'm recruiting you. I'm taking care of you." And you have a bad season and you get fired. That's crazy. Dino Babers is a good coach, but to be a coach today, you got to do 2 things. You got to, number one, you got to win. Number two, you got to exceed expectations. And number three, which I didn't say, is you got to make sure you have a deal that if they fire you, you get some money on the way out the door. Because just as easy as these kids are leaving you, it's just as easy as the school will leave you too.